Look around you. Everything you learned in school, formulas, dates, definitions, names, gone. Most of it anyway, dissolved somewhere between the exam and real life. And you probably blamed yourself. I'm bad at memorizing. I should have studied harder. My memory is terrible. Here's the thing. You weren't failing at school. School was failing at you. And Richard Feynman knew it. Not because he had bad memory. He had a spectacular memory. He knew it because he understood something most teachers never figure out. Memorization isn't learning. It's the opposite of learning. Wait, let me say that again. Memorizing is not learning. It's what you do instead of learning. And the difference between those two things? It's the difference between knowing where you are in the universe and knowing the name of the street. Now, let me tell you something that's going to reframe everything you think you know about how the human mind works. There's a moment. A specific type of moment. Feynman described it over and over in different ways. You're walking, or you're in the shower, or you're half asleep, and suddenly something clicks. Not something you memorized, something you understood. And the understanding floods you like pressure behind a wall finally breaking through. That's the thing. That's what we're chasing. That moment doesn't come from a flashcard. It doesn't come from reading the same paragraph 7 times. It comes from something different. Something almost physical. Something Feynman spent his entire life trying to teach, and that most schools spend their entire existence accidentally preventing. Hold that thought. We're coming back to it. First, let me tell you about a mango. Feynman grew up in Far Rockaway, Queens. Not exactly a physics mecca. His father, Melville Feynman, was a salesman. He never went to college, knew nothing about physics, but he did something extraordinary when Richard was small. Something that set the trajectory of one of the greatest minds in the 20th century. He didn't teach his son answers. He taught him questions. They'd walk in the woods. Little Richard would point at a bird. "What's that bird, Dad?" And his father would say, "And this is real. This is documented. That's a brown-throated thrush. But in Portuguese, it's a pássaro de canto. In Chinese, they call it something else. In Japanese, something else again." Then he'd look at his son and say, "Now you know what it's called in every language, and you know absolutely nothing about the bird. Nothing." That one line contains more wisdom about education than most doctoral theses. Here's what his father understood intuitively. Knowing the name of something gives you the illusion of understanding. The word becomes a container. And once you have the container, your brain thinks it's full. It stops asking questions. It stops looking. The name is the trap. Strange, isn't it? The thing we're taught to collect names, terms, definitions, is the exact thing that shuts down genuine curiosity. You know what that means for everything you studied in school? Let's talk about physics class. Specifically, Newton's second law. F equals ma. Force equals mass times acceleration. You've seen it. Most people memorized it. Some people can even use it in simple problems. And then a few years after school, almost everyone forgets it entirely. Why? Because F equals ma is a name. It's a label on a container. And if you memorize the formula without ever feeling the thing it describes, you learn nothing. You carried a ticket to a concert you never attended. Now let me show you what Feynman would do instead. Push something. Go ahead. Push the table in front of you, or your coffee cup, or just your palm against your other palm. Feel that? The harder you push, the faster it accelerates. More force, more acceleration. Simple. Now imagine the table as a truck. Same push, less acceleration. Why? Because mass resists change. The more stuff there is, the more it fights against being moved. That's it. That's all F equals ma is saying. It's describing something you felt 10,000 times in your body. The formula is just the English translation of a physical experience you already had before you could read. See? You already knew Newton's second law. You just didn't know you knew it. Now here's where it gets disturbing. What did school ask you to do? Memorize the translation. Only the translation. Without ever pointing at the original experience. It's like teaching someone to say, "I love you," in French without ever explaining what love is. Words without referent. Sounds without signal. And this is not an accident. It's structural. It's baked into how education was designed. Here's something nobody mentions. Modern mass education wasn't designed to produce thinkers. That's not a conspiracy theory, it's history. Compulsory schooling at scale was built during the Industrial Revolution, factory era. The economy needed people who could follow instructions, repeat procedures, show up on time. Memorization was a feature, not a bug. Think about that for a second. The system was optimized for compliance and repetition. Understanding was a side effect at best. And we've been running that same operating system with cosmetic updates for about 150 years. Feynman understood this viscerally, not because he read education theory, because he felt the difference in his own skull between the moment something clicked and the moment something was merely stored. And those two things feel completely different. Wait, let me tell you about his time in Brazil. 1951. Feynman teaches physics at the Brazilian Center for Physical Research in Rio. He's excited. Brazil. Students everywhere. Brilliant young people hungry for science. And then he watches them. And something deeply wrong becomes visible. The students are incredible at the textbook. They can recite. They can solve the practice problems. They perform beautifully on tests. And then Feynman does something devious. He asks a simple question about a physical situation. Something real. Something you'd see on the street. Blank faces. Total disconnection. They had learned the words perfectly. They had no idea what the words referred to. He called it a fragile knowledge. It breaks the instant you move outside the exact context where you acquired it. It can't generalize. It can't transfer. It's crystallized in one specific shape, and reality never comes in that shape. Fragile knowledge. And you've experienced this. Everyone has. You studied for an exam, did fine, and 2 weeks later someone asks you a real question about that subject, slightly reworded, slightly different context, and your mind finds nothing. Not because you forgot, because you never actually encoded it as understanding. You encoded it as a sequence, a pattern, a song, and the request came in the wrong key. Think about that. Now comes the part that should genuinely disturb you. The problem isn't just that memorization is inefficient. It's not just that facts fade. It's that excessive memorization actively damages your ability to think. Here's the mechanism. When your brain memorizes without understanding, it builds what neuroscientists call isolated knowledge nodes. Disconnected pieces. Little islands with no bridges between them. Understanding, by contrast, builds networks. Meshes. A new piece of knowledge connects to 10 other pieces, which connect to 10 more. The brain wires itself for generalization, for transfer, for creativity. One brain is an archipelago, unreachable islands. The other is a continent. Now, here's the brutal part. Every hour you spend drilling facts without understanding every hour is an hour where your brain is literally building archipelago instead of continent. It's structural. It's physical. The wiring happens whether you want it or not. And it's hard to reverse. Not impossible, but hard. Feynman knew this. Not from neuroscience. Most of that research happened after his death. He knew it from introspection. From watching the look on faces when something finally, genuinely made sense versus when it was merely acquired. Those are different faces. Anyone who's ever taught knows this. Now let me tell you something beautiful. Feynman had a method. Not a memorization technique. Not a hack. A different orientation toward knowledge entirely. He called it loosely first principles thinking. Though he'd probably hate that I'm naming it, because naming it is exactly the problem. The idea is this. When you encounter anything, any concept, any formula, any claim, you ask one question. What is this actually describing? What physical thing? What experience? What process does this correspond to? Not what is it called? What is it? Every time. Relentlessly. If you can't answer that question, you don't understand it yet. The name means nothing. The definition means nothing. You have an empty container. Here's the test. And this is actually called the Feynman Technique, though he never named it himself. When you think you understand something, try to explain it to a 12-year-old. Not a summary. Not a definition. An explanation. The moment you hit a piece you can't explain, simply there it is. That's the gap. That's where the illusion lives. That's the seam between the label and the thing. Most people never find that seam. They live their entire lives with the label, mistaking it for the thing. Strange, isn't it? Let me give you a concrete example that will change how you see every documentary you've ever watched. Black holes. You know the name. You might know the definition: a region of space-time where gravity is so strong that nothing, not even light, can escape. You might even have an image in your mind. Dark circle, glowing ring. Dramatic. Now here's the Feynman test. What actually happens to time near a black hole? Not what it's called. Not the term. What happens? Most people get stuck here. Here's the thing. Time slows down. Actually, physically slows down. 1 second near a black hole's edge is thousands of years at Earth's surface. If you had a friend hovering at the event horizon, which you can't, but stay with me and you watch them from far away, you'd see them freeze, suspended in a moment. a living photograph of the instant before they cross the edge.
From their perspective, they'd see the entire future of the universe flash by in an instant, every star burning out, every galaxy drifting into darkness, all of time, compressed into one falling second. Now, does that disturb you? Good. Because if you understood that really understood it, not just read the words you're doing, something most textbooks never achieve. You felt the concept with something other than your short-term memory. That feeling is understanding. And here's where it connects back to Feynman. He wasn't just talking about learning efficiency, he was talking about something deeper, about what it means to be in genuine contact with reality versus being in contact with the map of reality. The map is useful, don't get me wrong. Feynman wasn't anti-knowledge. He was anti-label as substitute for knowledge. But most people, in most schools, for most of their lives, spend enormous energy becoming experts in the map, and they never look up. Now here's the part I find truly astonishing. The things you actually understand, not memorized, actually understood, you never forget. Think about it. You understand that hot things burn. You don't refresh that memory periodically. You don't review it before bed. It's structural. It's woven into the fabric of how you navigate the world. You understand that heavy things fall faster. You feel it in your gut. Anyway, except Galileo proved that wrong. Two objects, different weights, dropped at the same time, hit the ground simultaneously, and your gut still doesn't believe it. Your intuition was memorized from casual experience, not understood from mechanics. That's the Aristotle effect. 2,000 years of obvious intuition about falling objects, and it was wrong. Wrong because people trusted the intuition memory over the mathematical understanding. See, memorization can give you wrong models that feel absolutely certain. Understanding gives you tools to correct the model. Nobody knows why the brain encodes genuine understanding differently than surface memorization. There are hypotheses, something about hippocampal consolidation, something about sleep-dependent memory processing, something about the emotional tagging that comes with the click moment. The real answer is, we're still working on it. But the phenomenology is unmistakable. Understand something, and it becomes part of how you see. Memorize it, and it's a passenger in your head useful until you're tired, or stressed, or asked to use it sideways. Here's where this gets existential. Your entire sense of how smart you are, and I mean this is largely a product of how much you are trained to memorize versus understand. Not your intelligence, your identity around intelligence. People who are good at school learn to equate quickness of recall with intelligence. They got rewarded for producing the right answer fast. They got rewarded for knowing things. People who were bad at school often had brilliant understanding, but slow or inconsistent recall. They could see the logic, but couldn't produce the term. They could feel the concept, but couldn't spell the vocabulary. They got punished, and then they believed it. They said, "I'm not smart, I'm bad at school," as if those two things are the same. They're not. Feynman himself almost didn't get into Columbia University because his score on a history aptitude test was too low. History, memorize dates and names, not physics. History, the man who would go on to develop quantum electrodynamics, win the Nobel Prize, solve the Challenger disaster, and fundamentally reshape how human beings understand the interaction of light and matter, almost filtered out by a history test. Think about that. The filter was calibrated for memory, not understanding, and it almost discarded one of the most extraordinary minds of the 20th century. How many minds has it actually discarded? How many people walked out of school at 16 believing they were mediocre because their strength was understanding and their weakness was recall, and went into a job that asked them to recall? That number is not zero. It's not small. Now, let me bring this back to something physical. There's a bird outside, right now, somewhere near you, or maybe you passed one this morning, and you probably know its name or you don't. And either way, that name tells you almost nothing. What does the bird actually do? How does it fly? What are those hollow bones actually like? Light as paper? Stronger than steel per unit weight? Honeycombed with microscopic struts that took 400 million years of evolution to perfect? What happens in the muscle when it beats those wings? A cascade of chemical reactions. Adenosine triphosphate splitting, mechanical force generated from molecular springs too small to see? You didn't know that. But now you can feel the edge of it, the shape of what you don't know. And that feeling, that precise, directed sense of the edge of your understanding, is what Feynman was actually teaching. Not content. Navigation, how to find where the real questions are. How to stop being satisfied with the container and start demanding what's inside. Now here's the part that should reframe everything. We are living through the most extraordinary transformation in human knowledge access in history. Every fact ever recorded or close to it is available to you in under 3 seconds on the device in your pocket. Memorization is now the least valuable cognitive skill you can have. Not zero value, but least. The most valuable thing, the thing that can't be outsourced to a search engine or a language model, is the ability to understand, to take new information and genuinely integrate it, to see connections, to ask the right question, to know when the answer you got is wrong, even before you can prove it. That's all Feynman. He was training for the world we now live in, 60 years before it arrived. And the school system is still, largely, training for the world that ended. So, touch your hand. Feel that? The surface, the pressure, the texture. You've touched that hand 10,000 times. You've learned how your hand works in a dozen classes. You know the word skin. You know dermis and epidermis if you memorized your biology. But do you know that right now, the outermost cells of your skin are dead? You're encased in a layer of biological armor made of cells that died so you could survive. That below that layer, living cells are constantly dividing, pushing dead ones upward like a slow geological process happening on your body every hour of every day. You are walking around in dead cells, continuously, permanently. Did your biology teacher say that? With that specificity? With that visceral reality? Or did they say, the epidermis has multiple layers, and put it on a test? There's the difference. There's Feynman's entire career as an educator. In 2 sentences, one is a container, one is a door. Only one of them opens to the universe. And maybe the most important thing Feynman ever gave us, more than the diagrams, more than the equations, more than the Nobel, was the permission to demand the door, to refuse the container, to say, I don't want the name, I want the thing. You've always had that permission. Most of us were just never told. Now you know.